At 1:40 in the morning, dispatch read me a license plate over the radio, and I asked her to repeat it. She repeated it without hesitation. I had been driving a tow truck long enough to hear hundreds of plate numbers every month, but there are some combinations you do not need to memorize, because your brain has already done it for you. I knew the plate on my wife's SUV the same way I knew the last four digits of my own phone number. I asked dispatch to confirm the vehicle one more time. Gray Honda Pilot, private property tow, reserved space violation at Cedar Ridge Apartments. You're the closest truck. For several seconds I kept driving without answering. 3 hours earlier, Melissa had texted me that she was taking our 6-year-old daughter, Lily, to her sister Ashley's house for the night. I was working another overnight shift, and Melissa said she did not want to spend another night as the only adult in the house while I was gone. Ashley lived 15 minutes from us and had kept Lily plenty of times before, so there had been nothing unusual about it. There was something unusual about Melissa's SUV being parked at Cedar Ridge Apartments at nearly 2 in the morning. I told dispatch the registered owner was my wife. There was a pause before Karen, the dispatcher, asked whether I wanted the call reassigned. She said the property had already submitted its normal authorization and that another driver could take it. But the nearest truck was more than 20 minutes away. I should have handed the call off. Instead, I told her I would go to the property, verify the vehicle, and call back if there was a problem. I was 35 and had been towing for 9 years. Most nights were less dramatic than people imagined. Flat tires, dead batteries, accident recoveries, cars blocking loading zones, vehicles left in reserved spaces, and a surprising number of people who insisted a sign did not apply to them because they had only been parked there for 5 minutes. The job also meant nights, weekends, rain holidays, and calls that arrived when normal people were already asleep. Melissa had complained about my schedule before, although not more than I had complained about it myself. The overtime mattered because we had a mortgage, a 6-year-old, and the ordinary collection of bills that made an extra Saturday call difficult to refuse. I had spent years telling myself that working inconvenient hours was part of taking care of my family. That thought followed me into Cedar Ridge. The complex was nicer than ours, without being luxurious. 3-story buildings surrounded landscape courtyards, and the parking lot had covered spaces with numbers painted on the curbs. I slowed near Building C and saw the Honda before I saw the space number. There was no mistake. Melissa's little school pickup sticker was still in the lower corner of the rear window. The dent near the passenger side wheel arch was the same one she had been putting off repairing since spring. I parked the truck behind it and sat with both hands on the steering wheel. Before I did anything else, I took out my phone and texted Ashley. "Is Lily asleep?" "Okay." Her answer came less than a minute later. "She's fine and fell asleep during the movie. Are you surviving work?" I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. Lily was exactly where Melissa said she would be, while Melissa clearly was not. I answered that work was fine, put the phone away, and called dispatch again. Karen confirmed the property authorization was active. The vehicle had no valid overnight permit for the reserved space, and the security officer on duty had requested removal through the property's normal system. Nothing about the tow itself was unusual, which almost made the situation worse. I lowered the wheel lift and started working. A security officer came across the lot while I was positioning the truck. He looked to be in his late 20s and carried the small tablet Cedar Ridge used for parking enforcement. He checked the Honda's plate against the request, then signed the authorization screen. He said the guest permit had expired and asked whether dispatch had given me any additional notes about the violation. I told him dispatch had only sent the violation. He nodded and looked at the SUV again. That woman usually parks here, so I figured she was staying over again. My hand stopped on the control lever as I asked what he meant by again. His face changed immediately. He looked from me to the Honda and then toward the truck door, where my company name and employee number were visible. "I just mean, I've seen the vehicle before." I asked how often he had seen it there. He shifted his weight before saying, "I don't really keep track, but she's had guest permits before." I could hear the hydraulic unit running behind me. I asked whether the reserved space belonged to the resident, who requested the tow. He checked the tablet and said, "Space 2." 14 is assigned to Unit 3B, and the resident is Trevor Hale. The name meant almost nothing to me at first. Then I remembered Melissa mentioning a Trevor from work several months earlier. She was a leasing assistant for an apartment management company, and names from different properties came home with her all the time. Residents with broken air conditioners, applicants with missing documents, people fighting over parking, vendors who showed up late. Trevor had been described as a restaurant owner who complained about maintenance response times. At least, that was the version I remembered. I did not ask the security officer for anything else. He had already told me more than he probably meant to, and I was not going to turn my work badge into permission to dig through someone's housing records. I finished hooking the Honda. My pulse stayed strangely steady until I began lifting the front wheels. That was when the glass door to Building C opened. Melissa came out first. She was wearing black leggings, a loose gray sweatshirt, and the slip-on shoes she usually kept by our back door. Her hair was pulled into a messy knot. Nothing about her looked like a woman who had stopped by a resident's apartment on the way home from a work event. A man came out behind her. He was taller than I was, broad through the shoulders, with close-cropped dark hair, and the kind of tired face people have when they have been pulled out of bed. He wore sweatpants and a restaurant t-shirt. Melissa saw the Honda first, then the truck, and finally me. She stopped so abruptly that Trevor nearly walked into her. For 1 second, none of us spoke. Melissa came toward me, lowering her voice before she was even close enough to need to. "Adam, don't make a scene here." I still remember that sentence more clearly than anything else she said that night. She did not ask why I was there, tell me I had misunderstood, or introduce Trevor. She simply told me not to embarrass her. I looked at the man instead and asked whether he was Trevor Hale. He glanced at Melissa before confirming that he was. When I asked whether he knew who I was, he looked at her again and said, "Yes, I know who you are." That was enough for the moment. Melissa stepped closer to the Honda and asked me to unhook it. I told her the property had authorized the tow. She reminded me that I knew it was her car, and I said, "I know exactly whose car it is." She told me to call dispatch and claim there had been a mistake. Trevor turned to the security officer and said Melissa was his guest, so he wanted the tow canceled. The officer checked his tablet and told him he had already submitted and signed the removal authorization. He could call the property's on-call manager, but the officer could not reverse it from his screen once the tow was in progress. Trevor tried the number while I called dispatch again. Karen confirmed that no cancellation had come through from Cedar Ridge. By the time Trevor lowered his phone and said the manager had not answered, I had finished securing the Honda. Melissa kept asking me to talk to her somewhere private. I told her I was working, and that Lily was safe at Ashley's, which was the only thing I needed to know immediately. The fact that I knew where Lily was made Melissa go quiet. Trevor looked between us without saying anything as I climbed into the truck. Melissa stood beside the passenger door and asked me not to leave like this. I told her I was not leaving anything. I was taking an authorized vehicle to the yard, finishing my shift, and then going home. She backed away as I climbed into the truck, and I drove out of Cedar Ridge with my wife's SUV behind me. The whole thing should have felt absurd, but instead it felt disturbingly precise. For years, my night work had been one of the least interesting facts in our marriage. Melissa knew when I left, knew I could be gone for hours, and knew a 2 a.m. call was ordinary enough that I would never question the time. Now I was towing her car away from another man's apartment, because the same job she had learned to schedule around had accidentally put me in the one place she never expected me to be. Melissa was home before I was. She must have gotten a ride after I left Cedar Ridge because her SUV stayed at our company yard until morning. I finished 2 smaller calls before clocking out and drove home shortly after 4. The kitchen light was on. Melissa sat at the table with both hands around a glass of water. She did not appear to have touched. The house was quiet because Lily was still at Ashley's. I took off my jacket and hung it over the back of a chair. Melissa began with an apology. She said she knew how it looked, then stopped and corrected herself, because even she seemed to understand that sentence was useless. "It happened," she said. "I'm not going to insult you by pretending nothing happened." I asked how long it had been. She looked down at the table and said, "A few weeks, maybe." I stayed quiet and waited for more. "Maybe a little longer than that," she added. "How long have you been sleeping with him?" Her mouth tightened before she said, "Adam, can we not make this uglier than it already is? It is already what it is, and I'm asking how long." She said the physical part had started recently, and that the relationship had gotten out of control faster than she expected. I asked whether recently meant days, weeks, or months. She settled on a few weeks again. I asked whether Ashley knew, and Melissa insisted her sister knew nothing about the affair. I reminded her that Lily had been at Ashley's house that night. Melissa said that was because I was working, and I pointed out that she had been at Trevor's. Melissa closed her eyes for a second and said, "Yes, I was." That was the first clean answer she had given me. I asked whether she had planned to spend the whole night there. She said she did not know. I asked whether Trevor knew she was married. Melissa first said he knew about us, but when I told her that was not my question, she admitted that he knew she was married. I then asked what Trevor believed our marriage actually was. Melissa pushed her chair back slightly and asked why that mattered right then. Because he knew who I was before I introduced myself. She rubbed both hands over her face before saying, "Trevor knows we've had problems." I almost asked what problems, because until that night I would have described our marriage as tired in ordinary ways, not broken. We argued about money sometimes. Melissa hated how often my phone rang at night. I resented being treated like I had personally invented the towing industry every time a call interrupted dinner. We had also taken Lily to the zoo 3 weeks earlier, ordered pizza on Fridays, argued about replacing the washing machine, and discussed where we might go for our 8th anniversary. Whatever problems Melissa had described to Trevor, I had not been told we were living through the end of our marriage. I asked whether she loved him, and she said she did not know before beginning to talk faster. She said she had never planned to leave me, had never wanted another family, and had never viewed Trevor as my replacement. She knew what she had done was wrong, as she had already been thinking about ending it. I asked when she had planned to end it. She could not give me a date. That answer mattered more than another apology would have. Melissa came around the table and stopped several feet away from me. "Adam, I know you're angry, but this does not have to become the end of everything." I told her I had not decided what it was going to become. She started crying quietly, but watching it gave me no satisfaction, because by then I mostly felt tired. She said Lily could never know the details. I agreed immediately that Lily should never be given the details. Then Melissa said, "Whatever happens between us, please don't let one terrible mistake destroy her home." I looked at her for a long time. A few hours earlier, she had left our daughter at Ashley's house, gone to another man's apartment, and told me not to make a scene when I found her. Now, the future of Lily's home was somehow being placed in front of me as a decision I might make. I did not argue with her about it. I asked one last question. "If this was only a few weeks, how many times did you send Lily to Ashley's so you could see him?" Melissa did not answer. She looked away, and the silence changed the room. Until then, I had been trying to understand what had happened at Cedar Ridge. That silence made me wonder whether Cedar Ridge was only where I had finally caught up with something that had been happening around my life for much longer. I slept until a little after noon. Before I went to bed, Melissa repeated that Ashley did not know about the affair, and I believed that part. If she had knowingly helped her sister create nights with another man for months, I did not think she could have looked me in the face without giving something away. By late afternoon, I was back at the yard early for my next shift. I had not spent the day chasing Melissa or driving past Trevor's building. I had slept because I still had a job, and now I wanted to look at the one set of dates I knew I had every right to see. I opened my own shift history. There was nothing secret about the system because every driver could see his completed assignments, call times, mileage, and shift dates. I had always used it to check overtime and make sure payroll matched what I had worked, but this time I was looking for something else. I started with the dates I could remember Melissa taking Lily to Ashley's overnight. One was easy because it had been the weekend before Memorial Day. Another lined up with a Saturday storm when I had been out until almost 4. A third was a Thursday in June, when Melissa said she had a leasing event and would not be home until late. I wrote the dates down and checked the call history attached to my own schedule. Several nights matched closely enough that the pattern stopped feeling accidental. On May 24, I had been on a late accident recovery until after midnight. Melissa had told me Lily was sleeping at Ashley's because she did not want to wake her when I got home. On the 13th of June, I had taken an extra private property rotation. while Melissa said she would be at a work dinner. On the 5th of July, I had covered another driver's night calls because he had a family emergency. Melissa had said she was too tired to manage bedtime alone and asked Ashley to keep Lily. Those explanations had sounded ordinary at the time, but now they looked arranged around the hours when she knew I would be gone. Melissa texted before my shift started and asked whether I had been going through records. I did not bother asking how she knew. Once her few weeks' answer stopped making sense, she knew I would try to understand the timeline. I wrote back that I was checking my own work history. Her answer came almost immediately. You're turning everything into evidence. If she had told me the truth, dates would not have been dangerous. I did one thing before taking another call. I opened the reservation for the 4-night anniversary trip we had booked in Savannah for October. Melissa had chosen the hotel, and I had paid the deposit from our joint card. I canceled the reservation and made sure the refund went back to the same account. Melissa called 10 minutes later, and her opening question told me the cancellation email had reached her before anything else. Why did you cancel Savannah? I'm not taking an anniversary trip, while I'm still trying to find out how long you've been lying to me. She accused me of making permanent decisions before I knew the whole story. I told her canceling a vacation was not permanent, but pretending we were still celebrating our 8th anniversary, while she argued over whether the affair lasted weeks or months made no sense to me. It was the first concrete thing she had expected from our marriage that disappeared because of what she had done. That evening, after Lily was home and asleep, I opened our joint checking account. I was not looking for hotel charges or expensive dinners. Melissa and I both used the account, and most of our regular expenses were boring enough that I could recognize them without thinking. The account was full of ordinary expenses: the mortgage, utilities, groceries, gas, and Lily's dance class. Mixed among them were small transfers to Ashley for $40, $50, or $60 at a time. The notes said things like, "Pizza and Lily, thanks for tonight," and babysitting. There was nothing suspicious about paying your sister for feeding and watching your child. The dates were what mattered. I copied 6 transfers into the same list as my night shifts. 5 matched nights when I had been working late. 1 matched a weekend afternoon, when Melissa had actually been with Lily at a family birthday, so I crossed it off. I wanted the list to contain only dates that actually raised questions. Not every payment I could force into the story. I did not want to build a case where every ordinary thing became proof, just because I was angry. I wanted to know what had actually happened. On the remaining 5 nights, Lily had stayed with Ashley while I was working. On 3 of those nights, Melissa had told me she was busy with some kind of leasing event, resident function, or staff dinner. I sat at the dining table with the account open in front of me and tried to remember how many times I had thanked Melissa for handling everything while I worked. That was the part that got under my skin. I had thought she was carrying more of the family load because my schedule was difficult. Instead, on at least some of those nights, she had transferred the load to Ashley and disappeared somewhere else. Melissa came into the room and saw the account on my screen. She reminded me that those were ordinary payments to her sister for watching Lily. I told her I knew exactly what they were. She asked what I thought those small payments actually proved. I turned the laptop slightly so she could see the dates. I'm trying to understand why Lily needed to sleep at Ashley's on nights. You told me you had a 2-hour work event. Melissa looked at the screen without answering. I pointed to the 13th of June and reminded her that she had said the leasing dinner ended around 9, while my call log showed I had not returned home until after 2 and Lily had stayed with Ashley all night. Melissa crossed her arms and said sometimes it had been easier than waking Lily up late. That makes sense if you were home, I said. She looked away, and I did not push harder because the point of the account was not to obtain another confession. I already had one. The point was that a few weeks was becoming harder to believe. The next evening, Melissa came to me with her phone. She said she wanted to prove that I was connecting things that did not belong together. She opened her message thread with Ashley, scrolled to earlier months, and said, "Look at these messages. Some of those nights were exactly what I told you. Sometimes Lily wanted to stay over. Sometimes Ashley invited her. And sometimes I really did have work." I took the phone because she handed it to me and did not search anything she had not opened. At first, Melissa was right. The thread contained plenty of normal family messages: Ashley inviting Lily for a movie, Melissa arranging a drop-off during a staff dinner, and photos of pancakes the next morning. Then, I saw a message from 8 months earlier, in which Melissa told Ashley I was working late again and asked whether Lily could stay Friday night. Ashley had agreed without any sign that the request was unusual. 2 weeks later, Melissa asked whether Lily could sleep over on Saturday because I was on nights, and another similar request appeared the following month. The dates were earlier than the affair Melissa had admitted. I looked up from the phone and asked when she had actually started seeing Trevor. Melissa's expression changed as she repeated that she had already told me. I reminded her that she had said a few weeks, and she tried to narrow that answer to when the relationship became physical. That still isn't what I asked. She reached for the phone, but I handed it back before she had to take it from me. I told her I was not going to spend the next month reconstructing every night. The messages were already older than the version she had given me, and the anniversary trip was already canceled. If there was a longer timeline, I wanted it now rather than after another round of partial answers. Melissa sat down, and the answer came slowly. She had started talking to Trevor outside work, about 8 months earlier. They had met for drinks a few weeks after that. The physical relationship began roughly 6 months ago. The overnight stays became more regular later. Her admission turned a few weeks into roughly 8 months of choices, including about 6 months of a physical relationship. Melissa looked surprised when I did not ask where they had met or how many times they had slept together. Aren't you going to ask anything else about that? I already know what happened. I'm not spending the next month collecting details that don't change it. She looked almost offended by my refusal to keep interrogating her. I told her I already knew enough about what they had done. The only question left that could change what happened next was what Trevor believed about me. Melissa became very still when I asked what she had actually told Trevor about our marriage. She first repeated that he knew we had problems, but I reminded her that she had already used that line. What did you actually tell him? After a long hesitation, she said, I told him we basically lived separate lives and that we were still under the same roof because of Lily. The room seemed quieter after that. For months, I had gone to work believing my schedule was one of the things our family endured together. Meanwhile, Melissa had described that same life to Trevor as proof that our marriage was already finished. She had never told me the marriage was over, filed anything, or told Trevor that I had actually agreed to leave. She had simply created a version where my absence at night, my exhaustion, and our daughter explained why I was still physically present. I asked whether Trevor believed I knew the marriage was effectively done. Melissa said she thought Trevor believed that version, which was the answer I needed. The affair was not built only on secret meetings. It was built on the assumption that I was already halfway gone and too tied to Lily to make the rest official. The following afternoon, before my next shift, I called a family law office. I did not ask how to punish Melissa. I asked what I could legally change before making any final decision about separation. The attorney was careful. I should not empty joint accounts, stop paying the mortgage or utilities, interfere with money needed for Lily, or use our daughter as leverage. If I wanted future wages directed to an individual account, I could do that as long as I kept clear records and continued transferring enough to cover my share of household obligations. That was all I needed from the call. I did not spend the day making threats. I changed my direct deposit. Starting with the next paycheck, my wages would go into an account in my name. I set an automatic transfer back to the joint account for the mortgage, utilities, groceries, insurance, and Lily's regular expenses. I also stopped the extra payments I had been making toward Melissa's personal credit card. For years, whenever her balance got higher than she liked, I had usually thrown overtime money at it because we treated everything as one household problem. I was done doing that automatically. Then, I opened a blank spreadsheet and started calculating what my life would cost if I moved out. I listed rent, a deposit, utilities, food, car insurance, childcare, lawyer fees, and what I could realistically afford if overtime dropped. Melissa came home while I was still working through the numbers. By then she already knew I had canceled Savannah. What changed that evening was the money. She asked whether I had moved anything out of the joint account. I told her exactly what I had changed and what I had not. The mortgage, utilities, and Lily's expenses would still be paid, and I had not removed money from the joint account. I had stopped sending all of my future earnings into a system where Melissa could treat my income, my schedule, and my silence as things that would always be available to her. She stared at the spreadsheet before asking whether I was seriously looking at apartments. I'm looking at whether I can afford one. Melissa sat across from me. The fear on her face was different from what I had seen at Cedar Ridge. That night, she had been afraid of being caught. Now, she was afraid I might actually act on what being caught meant. She said Trevor was over and told me she had ended it that morning. When I acknowledged that without changing what I was doing, she leaned forward and asked whether ending Trevor mattered at all. It matters, but it doesn't erase what happened. Melissa asked why I was still doing this if the relationship was already over. Ending Trevor did not erase the months before it. It also did not erase the way Lily's care had created free nights, Ashley's unwitting involvement, or Melissa's decision to describe our marriage as effectively dead while I still lived inside it, as though nothing had changed. I did not repeat all of that because she already knew it. I looked back at the rent numbers on the screen. I'm trying to find out what leaving would actually cost. Melissa's face tightened, and instead of arguing again about whether I had the right to be angry, she looked at the numbers on the screen. That change in focus told me something important. She had always known leaving would be expensive. What she had never expected was that I would start calculating the price. Melissa called her mother before I called anyone. I learned that the following evening, when her mother, Diane, phoned me while I was getting ready for work. She did not yell, and part of me thought that would almost have been easier. She said Melissa had told her what happened, and that everyone made mistakes, although she understood this was a serious one. Then she said Lily was only 6, and asked whether I had really begun looking at apartments. I asked Diane what Melissa had told her. There was a pause before she said Melissa had admitted there was another man. I asked how long the relationship had lasted, and another pause followed. She said it was a mistake that got out of control. I told Diane that still did not answer the question, and she finally admitted she did not know. That told me exactly how the story had been presented. The affair existed in Melissa's version, but the timeline did not. Ashley and the repeated sleepovers did not exist in the version Diane had been given. Trevor being told that our marriage was basically over did not exist. What remained was a simpler picture. Melissa had made one terrible mistake, had already ended it, and I was preparing to dismantle Lily's home before anyone had been given time to recover. Diane told me she was not defending what her daughter had done. Then she said, "I just don't want Lily paying for it." I could see the instinct behind that sentence, but it also landed exactly where Melissa needed it to land. If I stayed, Lily kept the same home. If I left, Lily lost it. The person who had spent months arranging those nights somehow became secondary to the question of what I would do next. I told Diane I had not made a final legal decision, but I was preparing for the possibility that the marriage was over. I also told her I was not going to discuss affair details beyond what was necessary. She asked what necessary meant. I said it meant correcting facts when someone was being asked to pressure me based on an incomplete version. Diane became noticeably quieter after that. I told her the relationship had lasted about 8 months, not a few weeks. Some of the nights when I was working had been used to send Lily to Ashley's house before Melissa went to Trevor. Ashley had known nothing about the real reason. I did not tell Diane where they had sex, what they had written to each other, or anything else that would only humiliate Melissa without changing the situation. By the time the call ended, Diane was no longer asking me to slow down. She said she needed to talk to her daughter. The next call I made was to Ashley, because unlike everyone else hearing softened versions of the marriage, she had actually been used to make some of the nights possible. She answered cheerfully and asked whether Lily had left her purple sweater at her house. I told her the sweater was not why I was calling. My voice must have changed because she stopped talking. I said I needed to tell her something involving the nights she had kept Lily. Ashley listened without interrupting, while I explained that Melissa had been seeing another man, and that some of the overnight stays had been arranged, so Melissa could go to his apartment. When I finished, Ashley was silent for several seconds. Then she asked, "Are you saying she dropped Lily here and went to him?" I told her yes. Ashley immediately asked how many times it had happened. "I don't know exactly. and I'm not trying to make you count them." Ashley's breathing changed before she said, "She told me she was exhausted. She told me you were working again, and she needed a break." I told her I knew, and Ashley said, "She made me part of it." That was the sentence I had been afraid she would say. I told her she had not done anything wrong. Ashley did not sound reassured. She said she had defended Melissa to their mother more than once when Diane complained that Melissa leaned on her too much for childcare. Ashley had told everyone that night work was hard on a family, and that helping with Lily was what sisters did. Now she knew at least some of those nights had been built around Trevor. Melissa called me less than an hour later. She was furious when she called. "You had no right to drag Ashley into this." I told Melissa that Ashley had already been involved. Melissa snapped back that her sister had not known anything. That's exactly why she deserved to know why some of those nights happened. Melissa accused me of trying to turn her family against her. I told her I had not called cousins, friends, co-workers, or anyone outside the people who had actually been involved in the situation. Melissa said that did not make what I had done any better. I told her, "It makes the story accurate." She started to say I was punishing her, then stopped. I think she heard how weak that sounded even before I answered. For months, Melissa had been able to decide which version of our life each person received. I was no longer helping her maintain those separate versions. That was all I changed. But the result was larger than Melissa expected. Over the next 2 weeks, Melissa changed the part of our routine she could no longer pretend had been harmless. She stopped sending Lily to Ashley's just because I was working late. If Melissa had a real evening event, she handled the childcare herself, or told Ashley exactly why she was asking before Ashley agreed. She took over more school pickups, stopped treating my night shifts as automatic free time, and apologized to her sister without asking me to mediate it. Ashley did not suddenly forgive her. She only told Melissa that if she ever asked for help with Lily again, the reason had better be the real one. I believed Melissa was trying. That mattered even though it did not erase the months when everyone else had been carrying pieces of a life they did not know existed. Melissa also said Trevor was gone, and I did not monitor her phone to test the claim. She told me she had ended the relationship after I changed the accounts, and I accepted that unless something gave me a reason not to. A week later she said, "It's over now. I'm not seeing him, I'm not using Ashley, and I'm fixing the things I did. There's nothing left to destroy our family over." That sentence explained more than she intended. In her mind, the active behaviors had stopped, so the marriage should return to its original shape. She still did not understand that the shape itself was what I no longer trusted. I told her I saw the effort she was making. When she asked whether that meant I would stop looking at apartments, I told her no. Melissa stood at the kitchen counter for a long moment before asking what exactly I expected to happen if I moved out. I told her I was trying to build a schedule where Lily could stay with me regularly. That was when Melissa said something I had been avoiding. I asked what she meant, and Melissa answered with a question of her own. "How are you actually going to make that work? You get called out at 2 in the morning. Sometimes you don't know when you're coming home. How are you going to have a 6-year-old overnight when dispatch can send you across town?" There was no manipulation in the question because the problem she pointed out was simply real. My current job structure worked because Melissa had usually been home at night. If I lived alone and Lily stayed with me, an overnight tow call could become a childcare problem in minutes. I had been calculating rent and utilities. I had not yet solved the harder part. The harder problem was time. Melissa saw that I did not have an answer and softened her voice. "This is what I mean, Adam. We can fix what happened without blowing up everything around Lily." I did not argue. I went to work thinking about what she had said. I had finally reached a problem that anger could not solve. My supervisor, Frank Delaney, had worked at the company longer than I had. He was the person who trained me when I was new, and he knew exactly which drivers preferred nights because the calls paid better. I asked him whether the day and early evening rotation still needed someone. Frank looked at me for a moment before answering. Frank reminded me that I hated that rotation. I told him the schedule itself was not the problem. I hated what it did to my paycheck. He nodded and said that was part of what he meant. The schedule covered more routine inbounds, dealership transfers, breakdown calls, and daytime private property work. It was steadier and easier to plan around. But there were fewer overnight accident recoveries and fewer weekend emergency calls. Those were the jobs that made a good pay period much better. Frank asked why I suddenly wanted predictable hours. I told him Melissa and I might be separating, and I needed a schedule that could support regular parenting time. He did not ask for details and simply opened the staffing calendar. The company could move me over starting the following month. I would still have occasional late calls, but the core schedule would end early enough that I could handle school pickup and bedtime most days. Then Frank showed me the average overtime difference. I had already estimated it. Seeing the numbers on his screen made it harder. On a strong month, I could lose several $100s. Over a year, it would be enough to matter. Frank told me I did not have to decide immediately. I asked him to make the change. He looked at me again and asked whether I was sure. I need the hours more than I need the overtime. The cost finally felt like something I was choosing rather than something being done to me. I signed the schedule change request before I could talk myself out of it. Melissa found out that evening because I told her. She stared at me across the kitchen. You're taking a pay cut just to make this possible. I'm changing the schedule so I can have Lily. You could have Lily every day if you stayed here. I told her I knew, and the answer stopped her because I was not pretending the trade-off did not exist. She had expected me to deny the trade-off, but I could not. Leaving meant less time with Lily. Changing shifts meant less income, and maintaining two homes meant more expense for both of us. Melissa was right about every cost. What she had not understood was that proving the cost did not automatically decide the outcome. Once the new schedule was confirmed, apartment hunting became less theoretical. The first place I looked at was too expensive. The second was cheaper, but nearly 30 minutes from Lily's school in morning traffic. The third was 15 minutes from our house and close enough to Ashley that she could still help in a real emergency. It was also smaller than I wanted. The kitchen had old cabinets with worn handles. The living room was narrow enough that I knew my current couch would not fit. The second bedroom had one window facing the parking lot and barely enough space for a twin bed, a dresser, and a small desk. The leasing agent kept calling it cozy, and I knew that was the polite way to say it was affordable because it was small. I stood in the second bedroom longer than I needed to. Lily's room at home had pale yellow walls, a bookshelf my father built, and enough floor space for her to leave toys everywhere and still complain she had nowhere to play. The room was undeniably smaller than Lily's current one, and admitting that hurt more than I expected. I had spent years working nights, partly so my daughter could have more than I had growing up. Now, I was considering choosing a life where she would have less space because of a decision between two adults. I almost left, but then I looked at the numbers again. The apartment fit the reduced income, and the school commute worked. The lease did not require me to pretend I could afford a lifestyle I no longer had. I filled out the application, and 2 days later the property approved me. I paid the deposit and signed the lease. On the way home, I stopped at a discount furniture store and bought a small white desk for Lily's room. It was not symbolic when I bought it. It was just on sale. That evening, Melissa saw the receipt on the passenger seat of my truck when I pulled into the driveway. She asked what the receipt was for, and I told her it was for Lily's room. Melissa did not understand at first, but then she looked directly at me and asked whether I had signed something. I told her the lease started the following month, and the color left her face. I had seen fear in her before, but never in quite that form. At Cedar Ridge, she had been afraid of exposure, and when I changed the accounts, she had been afraid I might leave. This was different because the apartment existed, the deposit was paid, and my new schedule was already approved. The first night she had told me not to make a scene, and I never gave her one. What frightened her now was quieter than a scene and much harder to undo. There would be a bed for Lily in another home. Melissa stood beside the truck and said she thought we were still deciding. I told her I had been deciding and that I had now made the decision. She asked whether everything she had been doing meant nothing. I said her effort meant something, but it did not create an obligation for me to remain married. Melissa looked toward the house. Through the front window, Lily was sitting on the floor watching television. You're really going to do this to her? I followed her eyes. The question hurt because there was no version of the future where Lily lost nothing. I would not see Lily every morning, and Melissa would no longer have her every night. There would be two homes, two sets of routines, and days when one of us missed something. I did not pretend otherwise. I'm going to make sure she has a father in both places." Melissa shook her head and said that was not the same. I told her she was right. It was not the same. She looked back at me, waiting for me to soften the answer. I did not soften it. For 8 months, she had built her choices around the belief that the difference between one home and two would be enough to keep me inside the marriage. Now there was a signed lease in my glove box. The difference had become real, and I had accepted it. Melissa did not tell me about Trevor right away. By the time she did, the lease on my apartment had already started. I had moved a few boxes, assembled Lily's desk, and bought enough dishes to stop eating over the sink. The place still looked temporary, but it was real. The night before I moved the rest of my clothes, Melissa came into the bedroom while I was packing and told me she had contacted Trevor again. She said she had panicked after realizing what 2 households would actually cost. If keeping the house became too expensive, she wanted to know whether she and Lily could stay with him temporarily. When I asked how Trevor answered, Melissa looked down at her hands and said he had refused. He had never expected them to live together. He believed our marriage was already nearly over, but he still assumed whatever happened afterward would be Melissa's problem to solve. When she asked whether he had ever imagined a future with her, he said he had imagined them being together, which turned out to mean something much lighter than the life she was now asking him to share. He had not imagined becoming part of a household with a 6-year-old, school mornings, childcare, bills, and a co-parenting schedule. That distinction told me everything I needed from Trevor, so I had no reason to call him or go to his restaurant. Melissa insisted she had not been trying to run to him. She had only been scared and wanted to know whether she had somewhere to land, if the house became too expensive. "You still thought he might be the place you landed," I said. She lowered her eyes instead of arguing. For 8 months, Trevor had existed inside a version of life where he never had to carry the parts. Melissa still expected our marriage to carry. Once she asked him to take on even a temporary piece of the real structure, he refused. Melissa eventually asked whether I was glad he had rejected her. I told her I was not leaving so Trevor could punish her, and his refusal did not make my decision feel better. When she asked why it mattered at all, I gave her the only answer that did. "It doesn't change my decision. It changes what you thought was waiting for you if this marriage broke." She watched me finish closing the storage bin. "You kept thinking there was another structure behind this one," I said. "Now you know there isn't." Melissa wiped her eyes but did not answer. Trevor had not become my victory, and I had no need to turn him into one. His answer simply removed the last place. Melissa had imagined the consequences might stop before they reached her. We sat at the dining table 2 nights later with a calendar between us, and the conversation stayed focused on Lily because nothing else mattered enough to come first. My new work rotation gave me predictable evenings, but it did not create a perfect 50-50 schedule. Melissa still had more flexibility during some weekdays, and there were occasional calls I could not control. We worked around school, dance class, weekends, and the distance between the 2 homes. The first version gave me 2 school nights most weeks and alternating weekends. I would see Lily less than I did while living in the house. There was no clever way around that fact. Melissa looked at the calendar for a long time before saying, "This is what I've been trying to tell you." I asked her to say exactly what she meant. "You're going to see her less. You're making less money now, and we're both going to spend more," I told her. "I know all of that." Melissa pushed the calendar away and reminded me that Trevor was gone. I ended it. "I stopped using Ashley for nights. I'm handling Lily differently, and I'm fixing what I can." I told her I could see the effort. The question was no longer whether she could behave differently. I was deciding whether I wanted to remain her husband, after learning how easily she had built a second life around the assumption that I would never truly leave. Melissa looked at the calendar again and finally said, "I never thought you would actually do this." That was the truth underneath everything else. She had expected discovery and anger to be survivable, because she had never believed I would actually leave. I asked her why she had been so certain. Her eyes filled as she said, "You love Lily more than anything." I told her she was right. Then she asked, "How can you choose a life where you see her less?" I had asked myself the same question while looking at the smaller bedroom, signing the shift change form, calculating 2 households, and imagining mornings when Lily would wake up somewhere else. None of those losses disappeared simply because I had chosen them. "I'm not choosing less of my daughter," I said. I'm accepting less time because staying married to you is no longer the price I'm willing to pay for seeing her every day. Melissa looked away, and I continued before the conversation could dissolve into another argument about details. You kept betting that I couldn't afford to leave. You were right about the cost, but you were wrong about whether I'd pay it. She looked back at me as the meaning of the sentence settled in. For several seconds, neither of us spoke, and then Melissa began crying without asking me to reconsider. Instead, she asked whether I hated her, and I told her I did not. I don't hate you, I said, but I'm done letting the fact that leaving hurts decide whether I'm allowed to leave. She covered her face for a moment. Then she pulled the calendar back toward her. We finished discussing Lily's schedule. That mattered more than ending on the perfect sentence. By the time we stood up from the table, we had pickup times, school mornings, weekend exchanges, and a plan for what happened if my work ran late unexpectedly. The marriage was ending, but our responsibility as parents was not ending with it. Moving took one Saturday and part of Sunday. My father helped with the larger furniture. Ashley brought over a box of kitchen, things she said she had duplicates of, although I suspected she bought half of them. Melissa stayed at the house with Lily until the larger items were gone. We had agreed that Lily would come to the apartment the following evening, rather than watch every box leave her old home. The first night alone was quieter than I expected. It was not peaceful. It was simply quiet. And there is a difference between those things. I had spent years complaining about toys under my feet, cartoons too loud on Saturday mornings, and Lily appearing beside the bed at 6:30 because she had decided sleep was finished for everyone. Now, there were no toys on the floor. There was no television running, and no small voice asking for water after bedtime. I sat on the second-hand couch and knew exactly what Melissa had meant when she said I would see Lily less. She had been right about that cost, and choosing it did not make the loss painless. The next evening, Lily came over carrying a backpack, a stuffed rabbit, and 3 times as many clothes as she needed. She inspected the apartment like a building inspector. According to Lily, the kitchen was too small, the bathroom mirror was weird, and her room urgently needed something on the walls. Then she saw the little white desk. She put the rabbit on it and asked if she could keep crayons in the drawer. I told her it was her desk, which was apparently enough to make the entire room acceptable. The legal process moved more slowly than the physical separation. There were forms, attorney calls, temporary agreements, revised schedules, and conversations about money that neither Melissa nor I enjoyed. Neither of us became poor, but neither household financially comfortable either. Melissa kept working while I stayed on the lower-paying rotation. Some months I missed the overtime more than others. Ashley eventually started speaking to Melissa normally again, although their relationship was not what it had been. Trevor disappeared from my life completely. I never found out whether he moved, sold the restaurant, started dating someone else, or stayed exactly where he had been. Eventually, I stopped caring about the answer. A few months after I moved, an accident recovery ran longer than expected, on one of my evenings with Lily. The new rotation was predictable enough that this no longer happened often. But towing was still towing. I called Ashley before the delay became a problem and told her exactly what had happened. A 2-car crash, a blocked lane, and at least another hour before I could get back. I asked whether Lily could stay with her until I finished. Ashley agreed, then added, "You know, you don't have to give me a police report every time you ask for help." I told her I knew, but there was one part I still wanted to make explicit. "I want you to know what you're helping with every time I ask." After a brief pause, Ashley said, "I know exactly what I'm helping with." By the time I left the truck at the yard and drove my own car to her house, Lily had fallen asleep on the couch with a blanket over her, and one shoe missing. Ashley handed me the shoe and said Melissa had called earlier about a school form. Their relationship was better than it had been, although not simple. I carried Lily to the car, and she woke just enough to ask whether we were going home. I told her we were heading back to my apartment, and she settled against my shoulder again. Ashley had watched my daughter because I was stuck at work, and she had agreed knowing exactly what the favor was for. There was nothing hidden inside it. I buckled Lily into the car, thanked Ashley, and drove back to my apartment. If you enjoy stories where betrayal finally meets consequences, subscribe for the next one. This is Blood Never Lies.